Working. So without any ado, please, Annakrisztina Pintér, enlighten us about stylistics, choice of words and their implications in Sumerian mythic narratives.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. I'd like to thank for the invitation. It's my great pleasure to be here. The main topic of the lecture series is text and history. The research history of the historicity of Sumerian literature goes back over decades. Multiple methods have been applied to interpret the Sumerian literary corpus. In today's lecture, I'm going to talk about different methods, how historical questions regarding literary texts have been handled, but contrary to the theme of the lecture series, the main focus is going to be on a historical approach. It's often hard to determine the date of a Sumerian literary composition, and the solutions for diachronic problems are also very complex. Therefore, I'd rather like to present how a stylistic investigation can be used to reveal certain aspects of works, which also relate to views on social classes. The two compositions discussed in the present talk, Inana and Šukaletuda and Enki and Ninmaḥ, consist of two dissimilar parts. The most common explanation given for the differences is a theory that these stories were compiled from already existing elements. Accordingly, independent stories might have been combined, and these originally independent narratives conserve their styles in the later redactions. It is an obvious answer, but besides these theories, I'd like to illustrate another method to interpret these stylistic differences, which considers the form of the compositions. Further, I'd like to demonstrate an analysis on the vocabulary and the sarcastic characterization of the gardener in the narrative Inana and Šukaletuda, which questions some of the previous understandings of this text. And finally, I'm also going to touch upon the question of commonplaces and stereotypes, which are also timeless categories in literature, and thus rather unfit for historical inquiries. So this lecture is going to show a few examples how philology, literary critiques can be applied when dealing with ancient texts, when we try to make sense of these literary productions. But first, I'd like to give a brief introduction on the historical approach which has been applied in the research of Sumerian literary texts, how historiography, historical issues, and literature has been handled by scholars. Oh, thank you. It requires a many-sided approach to date a Sumerian literary text if its date can be determined at all. The first one on the slide. Moreover, in the past decades, the historical approach to literature has been completely revised in literary critiques, and even its pertinence has been called into question. Nevertheless, many Sumerian literary compositions discuss historical issues and present stories of real personalities. Examples are the fictive letters of the kings of Ur or the third dynasty of Ur, or royal hymns, epics of kings. These compositions are tempting to be used as sources for a reconstruction of political history or social history, because these provide a vivid portrayal of past events. Other compositions display fictive stories. In mythic narratives, the setting and the plot takes place in mythic realms with divine characters, and the historic approach to them is not an evident choice, although these have also been treated as valid historical sources. Almost all literary works have been investigated from a historical perspective, even the mythic compositions, which take place in primeval times. The mythic corpus contains the stories of gods, transcendent beings. Still, many questions have been posed on the structure and the details of these works, which might reflect real foundations. For example, according to some researchers, the mythic compositions might have been influenced by social, historical, or political events and processes. Alexander, could you please switch to the next slide? Thank you. Not yet, the previous. Thank you. Aside from royal hymns, literary texts cannot be dated easily. The terminus postquem date of royal hymns is the easiest to be determined. They cannot have been composed earlier than the reign of the ruler mentioned in them. Certain group of texts written under the reign of specific kings use a characteristic vocabulary and grammatical forms, and thus other texts which have similar forms can be dated as contemporaries with these. For example, the hymns of the kings of Larsa have a special formulation, and these traits can be recognized in other genres and texts as well. However, many of these works have been redacted, revised, and adapted to later views and tastes, especially when they formed part of the education in schools in later periods in antiquity. Most of the excavated tablets containing Sumerian literary texts come from Old Babylonian layers, and these texts have Old Babylonian grammatical forms and vocabulary. But it should not suggest that they cannot be older compositions, only their formulations changed during the process of transmission. The mythological corpus has apparently evolved over centuries, both in written and oral forms. Only a few manuscripts have dated colophons. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. For example, the story of Anki and Ninmaḥ has a dated manuscript with approximately 20 lines inserted. This work excavation text 6, number 1. It praises the glory of the city of Ur. The insertion of this detail can be dated to the reign of the kings of Larsa, namely to the time of King Rimsin. The age of the composition, however, cannot be determined. It only proves that someone prepared an extended copy of this work. Nonetheless, it adds some information to the reception history of this composition. In the Larsa kingdom, a scribe found it important to insert a description praising an important city. Thus, the city of Ur was elevated to mythic heights. It remains a matter of a sophisticated guesswork what the reason for this insertion was, whether the king ordered it or whether it was prepared for a special performance or not. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you very much. There is a special group of texts which raised scholarly debates. It is the corpus of literary letters. These compositions describe interesting episodes from the era of the third dynasty of Ur. Scholarly debates varied largely. Some scholars understood these texts as useful documents describing historical events. Others rejected this approach because the language, the grammar, and the vocabulary of the letters contain later Old Babylonian forms. Therefore, the first option is that the whole corpus was treated as fictive compositions, and these are accordingly misleading as sources for the reconstruction of political history. The second option is to find out what the historical kernel of these works was. It means that some parts of these compositions were modeled after real events. Other episodes were merely literary inventions. So in short, according to the second option, real historical facts were embedded in a literary form. And another approach, the third one, the fourth, is to analyze these compositions according to the method called the new paradigm in historical sciences. According to this one, the question is how and why certain topics were represented in text and what it implies. This paradigmatic shift has put the emphasis on the motivations of the creators of the historical sources. This theory presumes that people present their views in a subjective way, and the historical sources reflect subjective observations and narratives. So the presented topics in these texts rather describe the period in which these compositions were created. and their uses as objective historical accounts may be thus questioned. For example, the epics of the kings of Akkad may not describe the stories of the kings of Akkad, but those of later kings and later political conflicts. An epic story written of King Naram-Sin, for example, doesn't actually present a real story of Naram-Sin of Akkad, but rather the stories of Naram-Sin of Eshnunna, who had similar conflicts, and this situation at that time inspired scribes to capture the struggles of their time embedded in a fictive story. Altogether, in any group of literary texts, the hardest part is that the grammar and vocabulary might change. The works are occasionally rewritten and adjusted to the needs, tastes, and views of later periods. Can you click to the next slide, please? Thank you. Also, the fact when text was written down doesn't determine the age of a work. It only shows when it was committed to writing, and older manuscripts might appear at any time. By the way, Nathan Wasserman has written an article on text evolution, but it includes intertextuality and citations as well. I recommend you to read this article, but I'm not going to talk about these questions now. And now let's continue with history and myth, which is on the next slide. Thank you. Fictive letters and hymns comprise elements, at least the characters, the kings were real personalities. Mythic compositions, however, pose a special problem. Their characters do not belong to the immanent world. The setting of the mythic stories took place in the beginning of times at the creation of the world. None of these stories have named authors. It is a material which was redacted over and over. New variants have been created. Most of the manuscripts are Old Babylonian. Some tablets might have been written during the Ur-3 period, and these texts have forerunners from the early dynastic era. Although we don't understand the early dynastic literary texts very well, it is clear that there have been many changes in stories. The leading experts of Sumerian literature believe that the mythic corpus can be used as a source for the reconstruction of political history, or at least social history. The theory that mythic representations and social structures are intertwined goes back to Emil Durkheim, one of the founders of modern sociology, who believed that religious systems and the divine world in mythic stories actually reflect human societies. According to Thorkild Jacobsen, ancient myths described early political forms such as primitive democracy. An argument for the use of mythic stories in historical reconstruction is the hypothesis that myth makers, as I said, might have been influenced by their surroundings while creating these stories. And different stories represented different stages of political development. And in his view, myths display the earliest forms of social systems. Epic stories illustrate the early dynastic social organizations, according to Jacobsen, and the stories of Ninurta, for example, present the later phase, the phase of kingdoms and how social structures at the time looked like. There's been another effort to compare the plots of mythic stories with political history. According to Klaus Wilke, some mythic stories imply historic political conflicts, such as the opposition of the Akkadian Empire and the Sumerian city-states. And these political ideas were hidden in allegories, in allegorical stories where the opposing parties were personified by divinities. As it is hardly possible to prove its pertinence, this theory has been neglected since then. Myths can be explained with an infinite number of theories, as they have been labeled vegetation, astral, fertility myths, or we could mention the myth ritual school as well, that myths represent rituals or rituals inspire stories, just to name a few options how the message of myths have been interpreted. And I just mentioned this reader response critique because it exists as well in literary critiques. Lately, postmodern literary criticism proposed to abandon the historical approach whenever possible. To take the most famous examples, Roland Barthes introduced the death of the author concept, which means that the circumstances of the creation or the compilation of the works, such as when and how the author created the work, is not analyzed anymore. Roland Barthes called attention to the fact that literary works come to life through the reception of the audience or the readers. And it means that the recipient was given priority over the author or the circumstances of the genesis of the work. Postmodern literary criticism ignores the notion of the author and authorial intentions because our perception of a text, our subjective understanding influences the meanings which we attribute to a work. And these perceptions always change. Every historic period has its own understanding of works, and our understanding of a text is shaped by our prior knowledge. But Assyriologists are basically philologists, so we are interested in historical problems. We want to date manuscripts, and first of all, this is our job to reconstruct the written culture of a certain era. Consequently, as we will see, articles and studies always go back to the questions of diachronical issues, the creation of works, the identity of the authors or redactors. The following two mythical compositions, Inana and Šukaletuda and Enki and Ninmaḥ, have one thing in common. They consist of two differing parts, and multiple studies have been written if they belong together or not, or if they were combined during the redactorial processes. The research history of Enki and Ninmaḥ, including the compilation and the relation, the connection of motifs, was summarized by the editor of this text, Manuel Ceccarelli, and the question of the date of the composition was also amply discussed by the editors of the text. At this time, I'd like to put aside the question whether the parts of these works were combined at a certain historical point or not. And I'm going to treat these works as complete and finished artworks, as they were treated by scribes in ancient scribes as well. So the following analysis will focus on stylistics and concepts which style can indicate in a work. Otherwise, please note that mythological compositions consist of motifs which have an independent existence, and these elements can appear almost anywhere at any time. So these motifs of the present story of creation appears, for example, in the Akkadian epic of Atrahasis. So let's continue with Enki and Ninmaḥ. The next slide can perhaps come. Positive, okay. So Enki and Ninmaḥ is a creation myth. The composition consists of two parts. The strike of the gods with the creation of the first people until line 51, and the contest scene between Enki and Ninmaḥ resulting in the formation of handicapped people. In the first part, the beginning of the world, the minor works had to work hard, so they rebel against the greater gods. As a solution, Ninmaḥ asks Enki to create a substitute who work instead of the gods. They finally create people, the substitutes, and the Anunnaki gods praise Enki's wisdom and skills. After this, they organize a banquet to celebrate it, where Enki and Ninmaḥ, the principal gods, get drunk. The second part starts at this point, and it has been observed by many scholars that the form of the second part resembles disputations, a special literary genre in Sumerian literature. So it looks like a contest scene between two participants, and one of the participants win the contest. So Enki and Ninmaḥ make a bet, and the drunken gods create handicapped people during their competition. The purpose of the bet is to find fate for all of these creatures. So while the first part presents creation in an elegant form, the second part can be understood as an ideological story for the differences in society, and also it parodies different occupations, social classes, such as officials in the palace. Can we go to the previous slide, please? The previous one. Thank you very much. So, in narrative text, the style of narration are based on the roles and the types of narrators. A story can be presented from different viewpoints. This is called focalization. The focalizer of a story can be the narrator or a character in the story. The simplest pattern of narratives consists of a narrator and character text. There is either a narrator presents a story or a character. The character texts are practically speeches or dialogues. The narrator can be further perceivable, imperceivable, objective, intrusive, omniscient, and so forth. His narration can be indicated explicitly, or he is as invisible as possible. For example, when the narrator says, "Ninku, my lady," referring to a goddess, so he addresses a goddess or a character in a story, or when the narrator inserts a rhetorical question into the narration, then he's perceivable and his narration quits the story word, because a rhetoric question doesn't belong to the story of the gods. The speeches of the characters can be presented directly, such as in dialogues between characters, or the viewpoint of the characters can be presented by the narrator. This is called deviant focalization. It means that what the characters see, perceive, hear, or think are not presented by them, but by the narrator. In Anki and Ninmash, the two parts of the composition evolves around the same motif, which is creation, but the modality is radically different. The first part is written in a uniquely elevated style with several appositions, epithets, and praises. The next slide has the examples. Thank you. The narrator provides many praising descriptions, so he is intrusive here. He says, the one of great wisdom, the creator of the senior gods, Enki. Or he praises his wisdom, how intelligent he is. The first part ends with the praise of the Anunnaki gods who appear in literary works quite often, especially when a great deed is to be praised or when the rightfulness of a god is to be emphasized. Thus, their praise always puts a stress on some kind of action of a greater god. In this case, Enki's majestic action, the creation, which can be read here in the citation, that all are wide understanding, who's as wise as you, and so forth. Adam Falkenstein has an article on the role of the Anunnaki gods in literature, by the way. As for the second part, on the next slide, thank you. The composition narrates the contest between the gods without any peculiar remarks. The narrator just simply tells the events without evaluations or appositions of praise. The style in this part is objective, and the narrator doesn't comment anything. So it just simply told that Ninmash did that, and then that happened afterwards, and Anki reacted so and so. My theory is that the stylistic difference might be explained by the different topics discussed in them. The creation of the first human being is a glorious deed, which is to be narrated in an eloquent style. The story starts with an elevated cosmological prologue, how the world was created. Enki is called all-wise, the one of great wisdom, the creator of all senior gods. Ninmaḥ, the mother goddess, is the mother of the universe. She is called the primeval mother who gave birth to the gods. And then the Enki's palace is hidden sacred place, also described by the narrator. And finally, the Anunnaki gods sing hymns. The second part, on the other hand, starts with an exorbitant drinking, and it results in the creation of anomalous characters. So creation is a great achievement in the first part, but the anomalies are the result of an irrational incident. And even the presentation of the praises changes. In the first part, it is the Anunnaki gods who praise the creation with a hymnic acclamation. As I've mentioned before, the reaction of the Anunnaki gods has an expressive force. It represents a collective opinion and mood in Sumerian literature. Their praise represents a pervasive, eternal reaction. In the second part, the praise is sung by Enki. He praises himself, and neither the narrator nor the gods comment on it. The narrator remains silent and objective in the second part, and doesn't evaluate the happenings, which means that he doesn't take the responsibility to point out the mistakes of the gods. So the differences between the two parts indicate that style could be used to express hierarchy, importance, and the quality of a topic. To sum up, you can of course try to establish the date of a composition. It's very useful, and draw conclusions of these. But in this composition, perhaps the use of style, the use of epithets and praises were intentional, and the modality of the two creations was expressed through the style of the narrative. Now, if we carry on with Inana and Šukaletuda, the other mythic story, Inana and Šukaletuda, we can go to the next slide if possible. Thank you very much. It also consists of two parts. In the first one, the narrative style is exceptionally complex. The narrative style of the second part is, however, much simpler. So before discussing this, I'll tell you the plot of the story. So the story begins with the description of the goddess Inana, who leaves her sanctuaries, just like in any other myth where she appears, and goes triumphantly to the mountains in order to reveal truth and falsehood and to inspect the land. The following lines are broken, so it's not clear how the subject is changed to Anki and the raven. The raven carries out surprising things. It gardens like humans. The god Enki instructs it how to plant seeds, and finally the date palms grow out of the bird's pots. The story of the raven and that of Šukaletuda has seemingly nothing to do with each other. Gebhard Seltz observed that it is perhaps the analogy between vegetal and human fertility, which provides is everything okay?
Just a moment. I think that we have some technical problem.
It's okay.
Yep. So we are stopping the recording now.
Thank you very much.
So to continue with the raven digs earth, pollinates the palm, and these details evoke the connection of agriculture and fertility. Thomas Merrick also suggested that the materials used here, oil, coal, used by the raven, might recall tools of divination or cosmetics and the preparations for marriage, foreshadowing Šukaletuda's actions. So there are shared motifs which are in connection with the sacred marriage rituals, fertility, agriculture. Then the date palm sprouts and blossoms, and its usefulness and its worthiness to the royal palace and the temples of the gods are highlighted. After the description of date palm, the story goes on with Šukaletuda, the unsuccessful gardener. His plants perish and the wind blows dust into his eyes. Then he wipes out the dust from his eyes, which has an extraordinary result. He gains vision to the other world. There he sees a ghost and the goddess Inana sleeping under a tree. Šukaletuda violates her and goes back to his field. When Inana wakes up, she notices its evidence and starts to seek after the committer. Up until this point, the text contains rhetorical questions, which is now what did one say to another? What else can one add to another? The second part, starting with Inana's chase, perhaps the next slide, doesn't contain rhetoric questions, and the narration consists of dialogues and simple descriptions of events, accounts of what the characters do. Here, Inana hunts after Šukaletuda and imposes plagues on the country anytime her attempts to find him prove to be unsuccessful. And then in the end, Šukaletuda hides among the black-headed people in the mountains, as advised by his father. But Inana appeals to Enki for help, and Enki promises to compensate her, and he hands over Šukaletuda to the goddess, who kills the gardener. Now, the narrative formulation of the composition is quite special. As I've mentioned, the composition consists of two parts, which are characterized by the narrative style, and most importantly, the appearance of rhetorical questions. Inana and Šukaletuda is quite peculiar in this regard among Sumerian narratives. The narrator and the narration become perceivable with the rhetorical questions, which is very exceptional. And the story is told in a way that the performer appears explicitly through these questions, which do not belong to the story world. There is the happenings around the goddess and the gardener. The narration is thus double layered. The narration contains another narration which separates the audience from the story world. And also, when the narrator describes the events, he uses the so-called deviant vocalization, which means that although the text appears in a narrator text, the perception of the events and its description do not belong to the narrator, but to a character. Accordingly, the narrative style is omniscient and intrusive. Generally, in Sumerian mythic narratives, it is the characters who describe in their speeches what they see. In the first part, in Inana and Šukaletuda, the narrator tells what Šukaletuda sees and thinks. As you can read it, that he raised his eyes to the lower land and saw the exalted gods where the sun rises, and he even raises a question to himself, Šukaletuda, if he had seen these things before, and now the gardener was quite surprised at what he saw under the tree, and that's how the incident happened. Deviant vocalization allows an indirect view on the events. The audience doesn't directly hear it from the gardener through his speech. Consequently, it highlights the fact that Šukaletuda did not discuss his intention with anyone. He did this in secret. He kept it to himself. Other mythic stories in Sumerian literature apply direct vocalization, and the characters first tell their wishes before they act. So what they want to do appears in a character text. For example, in the story of Enlil and Ninlil, the god Enlil doesn't hesitate to share his intention with the audience. He quite clearly tells that I want to kiss you, do this and do that. And it's not the case in Inana and Šukaletuda, where the intentions of the gardener are hid in a narrative text. This indirect style of narration in Inana and Šukaletuda, the deviant vocalization, portrays the events as an internal experience of vision. And this vision gains a subjective tone. So nobody can verify Šukaletuda's actions, and the refrains, the rhetorical questions, also points out its incomprehensibility, such as who has ever seen such a thing. The refrain occurs regularly in other genres, in disputations, for example, and in incantations. In disputations, the members argue with each other. One of the characters wins the contest, and occasionally they raise the question that, and what else can you add to this argument to oppose my opinion? So it's a typical form in disputation points. Here in this example, the mixing of the genres makes the senses of the story, the possible readings more complex, and call attention to the fact that this situation departs from the norm. There is something unusual involved here. With this formula taken from disputation, the composition creates a controversial situation in its narration. As the reference says, now what can you add to this issue? How can you oppose this? Consequently, the case is not an indisputable, unquestionable case presented with the standard objective narrative style, which appears in most of the Sumerian mythic compositions. The next topic I'd like to discuss is Šukaletuda's characterization as a common man and the wording of a story, which is going to be a philological analysis. But before continuing with the analysis on the lexical peculiarities of the text, I'd like to briefly present the previous interpretations of these compositions, which are all relevant, given that, as we have seen, Inana and Šukaletuda has a complex fabula with unusual style. So this story has evoked multiple theories on its meaning. The first editor, Kramer, highlighted the plagues in the story and compared it with the biblical stories. Then Conrad Fock provided an elaborate analysis on each part of the text, the place, the elements of the gardening raven, and the significance of the story in the Mesopotamian political setting. It has also been assumed that Inanna's route describes the path of the Venus, so it's an astral myth, and recent research has dealt with the aspects of fertility in the myth. As the insertion of the raven's episodes seems to be hardly justified, the connection between the raven and Šukaletuda's story might be the analogy between vegetal and human fertility, perhaps foreshadowing Šukaletuda's action. And the final episode, Šukaletuda's blessing by Inanna, has raised many questions. Because after this violating incident, Inanna looks for the gardener, and when she finds him, the gardener receives a favor. He gets eternal fame from Inanna. So according to the interpretations, what Šukaletuda did was a disfigured royal ritual, the violation of the sacred marriage ritual, where it is normally the kings who participate as Dumuzi, Inanna's divine husband. Therefore, it can be understood as an anti-myth dealing with the orders of the rituals and the rules of the divine decrees. Despite the fact that Šukaletuda's involvement was illegitimate, what he did was a ritual where the goddess is obliged to bless the king and the people. And as a result, his fate becomes the same as that of Inanna's spouse Dumuzi, and he can dwell in the palace of the steppe. Can we go to the next slide, please? And the next one. So this is the text of the blessing, which contains many interesting phrases. So Inanna, at the end of the text, delivers this speech, which can read here, that Šukaletuda's fame will appear in songs and told by the shepherds, the small singers in the royal palace, and the shepherds will sing it while churning milk and spread it at the forts. So this baffling speech has triggered several scholarly remarks on the contradictory issue. Šukaletuda received here favorable fate, the everlasting fame much coveted by kings, despite his improper deed. The text was thus rather understood as a blessing and not a curse. It is not only the content of the speech which provides a favorable impression on the fate decree, but the choice for the capping phrase before that is very strange too, because the text says that Inanna decreed fate, the phrase namtar is used and not namkud to curse someone. Yet, in view of some elements in the composition, such as the enumerated professions in the blessing, Šukaletuda's characterization, and the narrative structure of the text, the favorability of the fate can be disputed. The wording of the text renders Šukaletuda to the lower classes, and the formulation questions the correctness of his deed. So taken together, these findings, these relativize the favorability of Šukaletuda's fate. He doesn't receive the much sought after fate of high-class members, the kings. His fame might last eternally, as it says, but it will be transmitted by low-class workers, such as the shepherd boys and the beginning singers. Just to compare in the next slide, the portrayal of Mesopotamian kings. Can we go to the next slide, please? Oh, yes. So Mesopotamian kings are portrayed as great personalities nursed by the gods and singled out from among million people. Royal inscriptions praise their charisma, their wisdom, their strength, their divine relatives and power. The best example can be found in Buddha's statue B, where his origin is described, how he was selected by the gods because he was such an outstanding personality. It is pointed out in Inana and Šukaletuda repeatedly that Šukaletuda is not an outstanding personality. Even his name has a bizarre meaning. Literally, Šukaletuda means that the one born of rare hand. An ancient Sumerian Akkadian lexical list translates the word Šukaletuda as a skin disease, such as smallpox, warty, leprous. Further, Shu hand occurs in other disease names, composed of Shu plus divine name, when it refers to some kind of divine blow or curse or illness. Can we go to the next slide, please? So besides Šukaletuda, or Spotty in English, as Jeremy Black translated his name, he's not a chief gardener, but a simple water drawer. The text says that Šukaletuda was his name, a son of Igisiksig. He was to water the garden plus build installation for a well among the plants. This was his job, to water the gardens. According to the wages paid to agricultural workers and gardeners, water drawers were at the bottom of the hierarchy, as analysis on gardening in ancient Mesopotamia have demonstrated. The lines following his name, Šukaletuda's name, when he is introduced in the story, are partly broken, so the sign standing before 6767 is there. Cannot be established with certainty what stands there. Conrad Folk reconstructs it to Igisiksig. Igisiksig appears in other sources. It's a name. In the list of divinities on Anu, Igisiksig is listed as the god of An's gardener, and the Middle Assyrian incantation describes Igisiksig as a divine gardener plucking out plants for medical use. Whether Igisiksig is Šukaletuda's father or his divine protege, or it is Šukaletuda's fields in the following lines, we can't decide it for sure. What's important is that 67a is a designation for low-class gardeners in economic text, and they are mentioned together with water drawers. As Wolfgang Heimpe and Piotr Steinkeller demonstrated, the sense of this phrase, 6-7, might be blinded. In Mesopotamia, prisoners of war were often sent to corvée labor to work in gardens, and lest they should escape, they might have been blinded. Other theories exclude the possibility of blinding, pointing out rather a term for unskilled workers. I'm not going to undertake a decisive study on this word. The key point is Šukaletuda's low pedigree here. There's another appellation for the gardener. It can be found in the scene when he visits his father and asks for his advice. Šukaletuda is called here Lutur, small man. Tur can be used in the sense of young, such as the god Enlil is called young when he was in the age of marriage to marry another woman. But besides its use as a reference to his age, it might recall his low status as well. it has been underlined that this designation means a small guy, which has a lot of references to tales where the protagonist is a common man. It's very well known in world literature as well. And the next one, if we go to the next slide, the fatherly advice following this one. Can we go back? Yes. So lines 179, yes. This contains expressions which illuminate the inherence, Šukaletuda's inherence to everyday people, the black-headed people. So even the fatherly speech portrays Šukaletuda as a very ordinary person. The citizens are his brothers, and the goddess cannot spot him, which means that his look doesn't distinguish him from his fellows. It is quite the opposite of what's told of kings in royal hymns. Kings do not follow the black-headed people, but lead them, as we can see it in the next example on the next slide, in Lipit-Ishtar hymn C, where Lipit-Ishtar leads the black-headed people, his folks, and he has a huge power and lifts his head high and so forth. It is also an important objective for the kings to be noticed and chosen by Inanna. The next slide is an example, Orninunta, where the goddess notices very handsome kings and chooses them. Šukaletuda does the exact opposite. When Inanna finally finds him, he cringes and tries to vanish in the middle of the mountains, the place which Inanna mastered in the beginning of the text, the land of the enemy, where prisoners of war are taken from. So Inanna's curse determined the fate of the gardener, and according to this, he will die and dwell in the steppe, but at least his name will endure through the songs of the little shepherds and singers. This blessing contains a word which is small. It seems to be an unimportant detail at first glance. Inanna has this attributed singers and the shepherds, Nartur and Sipatur. Other examples from Old Babylonian literary corpus also affix attributes to singers. You can go to the next slide. Many of these sections in royal hymns describe how songs will be transmitted until eternity. The singers are never called small in these texts, but they are rather Narga, great musician, skilled singers, Nargazu or Narganzu, knowing singer, Umia, expert. That is to say, compositions of important personalities with the intention of being sung forever leaves the well-trained chief singers. It is the experts who are expected to perform the songs of King Shulgi, for example, or in songs which are performed at festivals all over the world and forever, as hymns often say it. When it comes to economic sources, mentioning the properties and the allotments and the duties of the singers in the during the third dynasty of Ur, 25th century BC, these enable the reconstruction of their approximate status. And some of these singers could gain a considerable prestige. Dudu, a singer with the title Galamach, chief lamentation priest, even married a royal princess. If Nartu, or singer boy, is a deliberate choice in Inana and Šukaletuda, then the curse specially underlines the fact that this composition will not be sung by expert singers, even if it's performed at the palace. And the shepherds are also called small. Churning milk is a common image in literary texts. It evokes peaceful, flourishing periods. But the churning in the sheepfold, there's another reality behind churning. So it might be a positive literary image, but the reality behind this is that the workers who churn milk in administrative texts, as we can see, they were on the bottom of the hierarchy too. So distinguished and idyllic places were selected for the ideal setting of the story in Inanna's speech, such as the palace and the sheepfolds. But it is the worst paid members of the social classes who perform this song. And as a consequence, Inanna's blessing and the formulation of the story, the characterization of the hero, Šukaletuda, contains irony, and Šukaletuda's positive fate can be disputed. As a summary, the next slide. These two examples have hopefully shown that style can imply messages, and the formulation of mythic stories contain views on social classes. In a philological analysis, there are multiple methods to follow, and all of them add something relevant to the interpretation of a literary text. With these, I try to demonstrate that the combination of methodologies might be useful at any time. And this is a point where it's hard to say whether these stories and the sarcasm and the irony contained in them reflect the ideology of a certain period or not. If the formulation of Inana and Šukaletuda expressed the view of Mesopotamians on the king and lower classes, or if it expresses an idea that members of the society who are not chosen by the gods and eligible for royal duties should know where they belong. As we have seen, several studies have tried to associate the mythic compositions with Mesopotamian environment, and some scholars even believe that these stories contain the critique of the editors, the critique of scribal circles. But these examples can be explained by more general terms as well. Bent Oster, for example, noted that there is a shared cognitive basis all over the world. Some types of jokes are universal, proverbs follow the same patterns, and the representation of social classes is also surprisingly similar all over the world. There are typical classes which are parodied in typical ways. Sarcasm on social classes is an eternal commonplace in literature. And given that parodies of serious topics are universal, it remains a question how Inana and Šukaletuda and Enki and Ninmash can be used as a source for the reconstruction of sociology and social theories in Mesopotamia in the 2nd millennium BC. Mesopotamian literature is a traditional literature which often operates with commonplaces and stereotypes. Consequently, further research would be needed to decide what the phenomenon exactly is. If we can talk about social theories, or these are just stereotypes. And the last citation just shows that anthropologists have observed the phenomenon in primitive societies that its members do not produce objective systematic reflections on their views on ideologies, but these are expressed with a complete cultural system, myths, rituals, and they see their cultures through the lens of these tales and narratives, and they avoid strong analytic approach. In order to reach a conclusion, more research would be needed, and I'd like to leave it for further discussion. Thank you for your attention, and this has been it.
Well, thank you very much, Annakrisztina, for a very fascinating lecture, and something which, very much like the compositions you discussed, was broken into two parts, courtesy of my electricity. We'll stop recording now. The button will let me this time. Where's it gone? I want to stop recording.